How's it going? It's good to be here today. My name is Paulo Di Gregorio. I've been here a few times in the past. It's good to see so many of you here today. So today's topic is one that is strangely current today in the 21st century, one that we're hearing a lot about if you watch the news. We are talking about the civil rights movement and kind of the legacy of the civil rights movement. How many of you remember some of the stuff that was happening the 1950s, 1960s? The civil rights movement was a very significant aspect, a very significant time in American history. We are a great country. We have a tremendous history, but there are some things we haven't been so good with in our history. And one of those things is race. Race is often the big question mark in American history, in American society. The interaction between races, the subjugation of certain races, and the civil rights movement of the 1950s, 1960s, and the legacy of that continues into the 21st century was developed. It grew out of this challenge of race in American society. So what we're going to look at today is the early part of the civil rights struggle, going from the 1950s into the late 1960s, basically 2 decades of striving for social and legal and political equality in the United States. The title of my talk is Like a Mighty Stream, the Civil Rights Movement, 1954 to 1968. Both of those dates are very significant, and as we get into the lecture, we'll address both of those dates. And where does that phrase, like a mighty stream, come from? But a speech given by one of the important leaders of the civil rights movement, Martin Luther King Jr. In 1963, he gave a speech, and in that speech he says, "We will not be satisfied until justice rolls down like water and righteousness like a mighty stream." Now, of course, Dr. King was a minister, so many of his speeches, much of what he said publicly was tinged with biblical allusions, and there are biblical phrases in that one excerpt. We'll talk, obviously, a little bit more about Dr. King as we move forward. Now, why is this topic kind of appropriate for the second week of January? What's the holiday we celebrate on Monday? Dr. Martin Luther King Day. So this kind of ties in with our calendar. It ties in with current events in the United States today. So what are the origins of the civil rights movement? Early in American history, slavery was an important economic entity. In particularly the southern parts of the United States, but really throughout the entire country. At the time of the signing of the Declaration of Independence in 1776, where was slavery illegal? It wasn't illegal anywhere in the British colonies. There were slaves in Massachusetts, there were slaves in Rhode Island, there were slaves in New York, and there were slaves in the southern colonies. And it remained that way really until the beginning of the 19th century. That's really when most of the states in the northern part of the Union began to abolish slavery. So it was kind of a piecemeal effort. Of course, what accelerates the end of slavery in the United States? But the Civil War. The Civil War was essentially caused by the issue of slavery. It was the issue of slavery that divided the Confederate States from the Union States. It was the issue of slavery that becomes the central focus of the war. When the war comes to an end in April of 1865, slavery is still legal. Slavery isn't abolished in the United States until the passage of the 13th Amendment in December of 1865. That's when slavery becomes illegal. Yet, despite the fact that slavery is illegal, there was still tremendous social inequality in the United States between the former slaves, the freedmen, the African Americans, and much of white Anglo-American society. So this social inequality, this social injustice was a big issue that was dealt with during the period of Reconstruction from 1865 to 1877 by the federal government. A whole bunch of civil rights laws are passed during that time period. The 14th Amendment guaranteeing citizenship to anybody who was born in the United States. The 15th Amendment guaranteeing the right to vote to all adult males in the United States. So you have those two amendments that are ratified during this period of Reconstruction. But when Reconstruction comes to an end, the federal government kind of takes its hands off of the issue of race relations. What happens, particularly in the South, but really throughout the country? We begin to see structures put into place that keep the African Americans down. It was de facto, it was social structures, there were legal institutions that were put into place. How many of you have heard of the phrase Jim Crow? What was Jim Crow? What were the laws, the Jim Crow laws? They were essentially laws passed through many of the southern states that constructed a social system where African Americans were kept at the lower strata. They enforced things like segregation. There were voting laws that were put into place to prevent African Americans from exercising their right to vote. It was all very carefully legally constructed in the southern states. Well, by the time we get to the early 20th century, we begin to see a demographic movement, a movement of people from the southern states into the northern industrial states, moving to places like New York and Boston and Baltimore and Philadelphia and Detroit and Cleveland, and heading west to places like Oakland and Los Angeles. You have this movement that was called the Great Migration. And the Great Migration was the move of African Americans out of the rural South, the area here in green on the map, into the industrial cities of the North and the West. Now, why did this movement take place? Why were people leaving the South? There were two factors, really. One was social. They were hoping to escape the oppression of the Jim Crow laws. And two was economic. Where were the jobs? In the industrial cities of the North. So what you had during this period of the Great Migration, which goes roughly from the 19-teens into the 1930s, was this movement of people from the South, the rural South, to urban areas in the North and West, hoping to make a better life for themselves. You have tremendous numbers of African Americans leaving the South and moving north. Now, this movement north is really the first step in the story of modern civil rights. Because as African American populations are moving into these urban centers, they are meeting other people, they are meeting other populations. There are immigrant populations that are in those urban centers. That often led to racial tension. But it also led to tremendous cultural growth and tremendous cultural development. One of the offshoots of the Great Migration was a cultural movement that was called the Harlem Renaissance. How many of you have heard of the Harlem Renaissance? What was it?
It was a great time for African Americans in New York City, culturally, musically, in schools, and they had a lot of talented people who lived there and worked there and made a great neighborhood for everybody. But they were still segregated. They
were segregated, and it wasn't only in New York. The Harlem Renaissance is named after Harlem, New York, the northern part of Manhattan Island, because that was really the epicenter of this cultural explosion, this kind of redefining of what it meant to be African American in the United States in the early 20th century. The Harlem Renaissance was, as I said, an explosion of literature and visual arts and music that was created by African Americans that encapsulated the African American experience in the United States. Some of the important figures that emerge out of the Harlem Renaissance include the poet County Cully, the sculptor Augusta Savage. Jazz musicians were part of this Harlem Renaissance. They were, in fact, one of the leading forces in kind of this spread of this African American musical heritage. In the 1920s, jazz becomes one of the great American cultural exports. There are jazz clubs that spring up in London, in Paris, in Berlin, Germany. Jazz becomes very closely associated with the United States in the 1920s. In fact, the 1920s are sometimes referred to as the Jazz Age because it becomes such an important cultural entity. And where does that emerge from? But the Harlem Renaissance, from the creativity of many of these African-American authors and musicians and sculptors. This gentleman over here in the front, Langston Hughes. Does anybody know Langston Hughes? You've probably read some of his poems, way back in high school maybe. A really significant poet in the United States. This woman over here singing, Billie Holiday, one of the great voices of the 20th century. So you have this cultural explosion, this redefining of what it meant to be African American in the United States, the establishment of a high culture, if you will. And it's the Harlem Renaissance that is really another step in the development of the civil rights movement. You begin to see the breaking down of social barriers here during this period of artistic creativity, and that will become a launching pad for future development and searching for future equality in the United States. So we're going to skip forward about 20 years to the early 1950s, mid-1950s, and a significant United States Supreme Court decision, Brown versus Board of Education. The Brown versus Board of Education decision, it's the Topeka, Kansas Board of Education that's being sued there, was a legal case that was actually the combination of 5 separate legal cases where African American families were suing various boards of education because of the segregation in public schools. Now, in 1898, the Supreme Court passed a verdict, a decision in the name totally escaped me. It was right on the tip of my tongue. But in any case, in this Supreme Court decision, it was determined by the court that segregation in public schools was okay, as long as you had separate but equal schools. That meant that if you had a town that had a black school and a white school, they had to have the same number of teachers, they had to have the same number of desks per student, that sort of thing. So it was institutionalized that you could have separate schools. You could have separate educational institutions. In practice, however, what happened? Were the schools equal? Usually not. Oftentimes you'd have a black school that was run down without enough paper, without enough desks, without enough chalkboards on the far side of town, and you'd have 3 or 4 white schools on this side of town, and you might have a black family over here. Where do they have to send their kid? All the way to the other side of town. That is the case that springs up in Brown versus Board of Education. The fact that the schools were not equal, though they were separate, and the fact that you had African American students that had to travel all the way to a different part of town, even though there might have been a brand new shining school in their neighborhood or closer, they still had to go to the other side of town. So these lawsuits are brought against the various boards of education. They eventually make it up to the Supreme Court, rolled up into this one big case of Brown versus Board of Education. Now, the lead lawyer for the Browns was this gentleman over here, an up-and-coming, a well-established NAACP attorney by the name of Thurgood Marshall. Anybody know Thurgood Marshall? What's his historical significance other than Brown versus Board of Education? He is the first African American to sit on the United States Supreme Court. So Thurgood Marshall becomes the lead lawyer in this case of Brown versus Board of Education. The case makes it up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court decides, as you can see on the headline there, that segregation in public schools is in fact unconstitutional and is in fact illegal. So we have in Brown versus Board of Education a momentous event in the terms of the civil rights movement in the United States, because now the Supreme Court is coming down on this institutionalized separation of the races, this institutionalized segregation. So Brown versus Board of Education is a first giant step in this establishment of the civil rights movement. The following year, the movement begins to accelerate. How many of you know Rosa Parks? Why is Rosa Parks famous? The bus. The incident on the bus. What is the story with Rosa Parks that leads to the scene we see over here, her being arrested and fingerprinted in Montgomery, Alabama?
She wouldn't give up her seat.
She would not give up her seat on the bus. Now, in Montgomery, Alabama in the 1950s, buses, like everything else, were segregated. And if you were African American, you were not allowed to sit in the front of the bus. The story with Rosa Parks is that she was a seamstress, and she gets off from work one day, is tired, has been on her feet all day, takes the first seat that she sees on the bus, which of course is at the front. When she is told to move to the back, she refuses to give up her seat and is arrested and fingerprinted, and the scene you see there on the screen. Now, the backstory is a little bit more complex. Rosa Parks had for years been an investigator for the NAACP. She had been going into various parts of the South to investigate people's complaints that their rights were being violated. So she had a long history of activism. And she was in fact chosen by the NAACP organization to be the one to test this law in Montgomery, Alabama. She was chosen to purposely violate the law to kind of spark protest against the law. So she's arrested, fingerprinted. There's a famous picture of her with the mugshot holding the arrest number in front of her. But Rosa Parks' arrest in December of 1955 sparks a protest, and it sparks a movement, a protest against segregation on the buses in Montgomery. A protest that comes to be called the Montgomery Bus Boycott. What happens in the wake of Rosa Parks' arrest is that many of the prominent civil rights groups in the South band together to encourage the residents, the African American residents of Montgomery, to boycott public transportation. People stopped riding the buses. The leader of the Montgomery bus boycott was this young preacher, Martin Luther King, who was freshly graduated from BU with his doctorate. He spends a lot of time in Boston as a grad student. So he meets his wife, Coretta, in Boston at Boston University. So Dr. Martin Luther King is chosen to lead and organize this Montgomery bus boycott, and it is stunningly successful. What happens is that the residents of Montgomery stop riding the buses. They begin finding alternate transportation to work, either walking or carpooling if people had cars, or figuring out how to get to where they needed to get to in the city of Montgomery without relying on the buses. And of course, what does that mean for the bus company in Montgomery? It's losing money. How do we institute change in the United States? Oftentimes, it's through the pocketbook. So that's one of the effects the Montgomery bus boycott had, is that it was hurting the bottom line for the bus company. The boycott goes on for the better part of a year, is stunningly successful. Eventually, the rules on the buses are changed in Montgomery. The boycott comes to an end. So what we begin to see here in the boycott is collective action taking place against segregation in the South. We see people organizing themselves to protest the injustice of this racial segregation on things like the buses in Montgomery, Alabama. So the civil rights movement really begins to grow in stature by 1956. The following year, 1957, we see the federal government having to get involved in enforcing the law. Brown versus Board of Education says that school segregation is illegal. But who was going to implement the desegregation of the schools? It was supposed to be the individual states, the individual school districts within those states. Well, in 1957, a handful of African American students tried to register for classes at Little Rock Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas. And they were greeted by jeering, threatening crowds, and the governor of Arkansas, a guy named Orville Fabus, standing at the school door, not allowing them in. We now have a crisis because Little Rock is disobeying the orders of the Supreme Court. Supreme Court says that the schools must be desegregated. The authorities in Little Rock refuse to desegregate the schools. So what has to happen? Whose job is it to enforce federal law? The average American? Possibly, but it is the president. The executive branch executes the laws. If the schools, if the states and the school districts were not going to desegregate on their own, it was the responsibility of the president as chief executive of the United States to force compliance with the Supreme Court mandate. So what happens? President Eisenhower sends the National Guard into Little Rock to escort those students into school. That's the scene you see over here. Now, imagine you're in high school. High school is a terrible time for all of us, in most cases anyway. But now you are being escorted into school with armed soldiers because of the hostility of the crowd, the townspeople, your classmates. The only way you can actually make it into the school is with armed guard. The bravery of those students was really phenomenal. It must have been tremendously terrifying to have to go through that gauntlet, to have to face this kind of reaction just because you wanted to go to school, and to have soldiers escort you into the classroom. So what we see here in Little Rock is the federal government beginning to become more active in the process of school desegregation, in the implementation of civil rights rules and legislation. The Supreme Court has said that segregation is unconstitutional. The federal government has to uphold that decision. And we see action being taken over here. So in the 1950s, we really begin to see the growing influence and the growing position of the civil rights movement in the United States. From relatively humble beginnings, we see Supreme Court decisions. There are bus boycotts. We now have the federal government taking action to ensure that students can go to school. The civil rights movement is beginning to grow. It's beginning to spread. It's becoming more and more apparent that action needs to be taken to solve this dilemma in American society, this injustice and inequality between the races. So Little Rock Central High is an important step in this evolution of the story of the civil rights movement. From Little Rock, we jump to North Carolina, Greensboro, North Carolina. North Carolina, a southern state, and as with many other southern states, lots of things were segregated. Schools, although those were beginning to become desegregated, public transportation, waiting rooms at train stations, and restaurants. In February of 1960, a group of students from North Carolina A&T University walked into a Woolworth's and sat down at the lunch counter and asked to be served. That was a violation of the law. African Americans were not allowed to be served at the lunch counter at Woolworth's. When these students were told that no, they were not going to be served, what did they do? They stayed there. And what we see is the first lunch counter sit-in at the Woolworths in Greensboro, North Carolina. The students refused to leave until they were served. Soon they were joined by tens, then dozens of other students. And we begin to see sit-ins at lunch counters breaking out throughout the South, throughout the country really, in protest to this, this injustice, to this reasonless segregation. Why could they not sit at the lunch counter? What was the entire reason why they were not allowed to? Because of the color of their skin. It was an enforced class system. You're not good enough to sit here and eat lunch with us. That sort of thing. So these students take a stand by sitting down and staying in their seats and refusing to leave their position at that lunch counter. This, as I said, begins a movement across the country, a movement of peaceful protest against segregation, a movement of peaceful protest against this sort of injustice. As in many of these movements, who becomes a leading face in it? Who becomes a leading actor in it? But college students. College students who grew up in a system of segregation and injustice, but want something better. They become many of the main actors and doers in this civil rights movement.
So interesting. Were reporters just on the lookout for anything different to get this picture? Or did people announce?
News spread.
I think it's a good thing.
News spread. And in fact, if you were to Google, lunch counter sit-in, you'd see this iconic picture, the one I showed you that you saw better on the previous slide. But soon there are dozens of people there.
I mean, the first one.
The first one,
People just watching people to see what they would do when they happened to get this shot, or did they announce ahead of time we're going to go do this?
I don't know if they announced ahead of time, but if you went into a restaurant and said, and asked to be served, and they said, no, we're not going to serve you because you're wearing your green shirt, and you have friends who are with you, some of your friends might pick up a phone and
They're sitting there.
yeah, word would spread. And of course, once word begins to spread, once it appears in the newspapers, it soon becomes a nationwide phenomenon, and we see people protesting in this manner across the country. Excuse me. So, as protests against segregation and protests in favor of civil rights begin to become more prominent and begin to spread across the country and throughout the South, the authorities in the South begin to spend more effort trying to put down these protests. One city in particular in the southern part of the United States becomes infamous for its resistance to civil rights movement. That is Birmingham, Alabama. Birmingham was an extremely segregated city. The chief of police, a guy named Bull Connors, did not want to see African Americans expressing themselves, did not want to see them pushing for civil rights and social equality. It was thought that that would destroy American society. So what happens? Birmingham starts to become a focus of much of the civil rights protest. We see lots and lots of action going on in Birmingham. In 1963, the protests in Birmingham turn violent. You have groups of peaceful protesters seeking to express themselves, seeking to push for civil rights in Birmingham, and the chief of police and the authorities in Birmingham don't like that. So what happens? The police come out and try to break up the protests through using fire hoses, as you see over there on the right, and police dogs attacking peaceful protesters. Now these images from Birmingham are broadcast on television across the United States. They are captured by newspaper reporters and printed in newspapers across the country. And the Birmingham protests become really significant because they draw further national scrutiny to what is happening in the South. up until this point, many people in the northern part of the United States, here in Massachusetts, New York, Connecticut, Minnesota, wherever, could look at the civil rights protests and think, well, that's a southern problem. That's something that's going on in the South. But all of a sudden, when these images start coming into your living room on television, when you are drinking your morning cup of coffee and seeing these pictures in your daily newspaper, it starts to become much more real. It starts to become much more immediate for you. So the violence with which the peaceful protesters were met in Birmingham is like adding fuel to the fire of the civil rights movement. It begins to grow, it begins to accelerate, and it begins to grow not only in the South, but also nationwide. Now, as the civil rights movement is growing and spreading, certain individuals, iconic individuals emerge that become voices for change. One of those individuals was this man, Medgar Evers, who was one of the leading figures in the civil rights protests in the South, speaking out against injustice, speaking out against segregation. He is one of the first, or is the first African American to enroll at the University of Mississippi, I believe. In any case, he is a leading figure in the civil rights movement. He is threatened by the, what we today would call white supremacists, by the establishment in the South. His life is in danger. Well, sure enough, what happens? In 1963, in the wake of those protests in Birmingham, Medgar Evers is assassinated in his driveway. He is getting out of his car and he is shot dead by a white supremacist. That white supremacist is eventually convicted of the crime in 1994. So Medgar Evers becomes one of these early martyrs to the cause of civil rights, to the cause of racial equality in the United States. He was killed because he believed that we should all have social equality, legal equality. So he is one of those martyrs to the cause. 1963 is really a big year for the civil rights movement because it does become more widespread. It does go nationwide. It goes international in many ways. We see the protests in Birmingham, the death of Medgar Evers. In August of that same year, one of the great public marches in American history takes place, the famous March on Washington, where tens of thousands of American citizens descend on the nation's capital to push for social and legal equality among the races. Famously, Dr. Martin Luther King gives a speech that day in Washington, standing on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, looking out over the reflecting pool. His famous "I Have a Dream" speech, one that I'm sure most of you have heard, or at least know that part, "I have a dream." Here's an excerpt from that speech. "I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character." One of the great speeches in American history, one that in many ways encapsulates the ideals of the civil rights movement, and that seeks to build on the ideals of the United States. We proclaim in the Declaration of Independence that all men are created equal, but does our history bear that out? Sadly, it does not. So we have this idealism that we have to strive for. And what Dr. King is calling for in this speech is that we try to reach that goal. We try to reach that ideal, try to live out the phrase that all men are created equal. that we are all endowed with certain unalienable rights. So the March on Washington is a significant moment in this civil rights movement. We are beginning to grow as a movement. It is beginning to spread. It's becoming something that is inescapable. It is covered by the news. It is recorded. It is filmed. It is nationwide. It is no longer a Southern problem. It is something that all Americans must work on. Needless to say, as the civil rights movement advanced, there was significant pushback from those who were not so friendly to the cause. A month after the March on Washington, in September of 1963, an act of domestic terrorism occurs, again in Birmingham, Alabama, when a bomb explodes at the 16th Street Baptist Church. Now, that church had been one of the centers of the civil rights organizing committees in Birmingham, Alabama. It was essentially the headquarters of the civil rights movement in that city, and it was a target for white supremacists, those who were not friendly to the idea of civil rights. In September of 1963, the building is bombed. 4 little girls are killed in that explosion. The perpetrators of the explosion, of the bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church, do not face justice until the early 21st century. Last month, there was a hotly contested election in Alabama for the Senate. The person who won, Doug Jones, prosecuted the perpetrators of this bombing. Justice 50 years later. So, the bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church showed that despite the peaceful intentions of the civil rights protesters, despite the fact that they were trying to use non-violent means to institute change, they were being met with stiff, violent resistance. The assassination of Medgar Evers, the bombing here at the church. Now, because of that resistance, many in the civil rights movement begin to think that maybe passive resistance, maybe a passive pushing for nonviolent change isn't going to work. How is it going to work if the people who are against us are willing to use violent means against us? So we begin to see, in many ways, a fracturing of the civil rights movement by 1963, 1964. You have Dr. King, who is still leading this, who still deeply believes in nonviolent protest, who believes in civil disobedience as a means of achieving change. But perhaps that change isn't coming fast enough for some people. Perhaps there are some individuals who want a more aggressive avenue to institute change. One of those figures who pushed for more aggression, more in-your-face type action to institute change was Malcolm X. Malcolm X is another one of these iconic civil rights leaders who had in many ways similar goals to what Dr. King had. The establishment of civil rights, the establishment of social equality, but also felt that if people were going to use violence against you, you had every right to use violence back against them. He felt that passive resistance was not going to work. It was not going to work fast enough. It was not going to bring change fast enough, and that more action needed to be taken. A stronger stance needed to be taken. He becomes kind of in many ways, the polar opposite of Dr. King in terms of how they wanted to get to their goal. Dr. King in the civil disobedience side thought gradual change, gradual resistance over time will eventually lead to change. Malcolm X and others, younger civil rights supporters thought that more action needed to be taken to bring this change much more quickly. Well, in the end, what happens to Malcolm X? He's assassinated. But he's not assassinated because of his civil rights stance. He's assassinated in a religious squabble. Malcolm X was a member of the Nation of Islam. He was an American Muslim. The Nation of Islam was led by a man named Elijah Muhammad. There were very kind of radical ideas in this Nation of Islam. Now, as a Muslim, Malcolm X goes on a pilgrimage to Mecca. And when he goes to Mecca, he has an awakening. He goes to Mecca and he sees Muslims from every country, of every color. And he realizes that the religion that is being preached by Elijah Muhammad and the Nation of Islam really isn't the true religion. So when he comes back, he has a falling out with the Nation of Islam. He begins speaking out against Elijah Muhammad and other members of the Nation of Islam, and that is really what leads to his assassination. It wasn't necessarily the civil rights aspect of it so much as the religious aspect of it. In any case, Malcolm X is assassinated in 1965. Well, the summer of 1964, before Malcolm X's death, is kind of a continuation of the turmoil and the push for social change that we see in 63. That summer is sometimes referred to as the Freedom Summer. Freedom Summer was a concerted effort by college students, black and white college students in the North and in the South, to head into the Deep South to register African Americans to vote. One of the tools that the white establishment in the South used to maintain power, to maintain control, was that they dissuaded blacks from voting. They instituted various laws, things like poll taxes or grandfather clauses or literacy tests to keep African Americans away from the polls. They also used things like intimidation and violence to keep African Americans away from the polls. Many blacks in the South did not know how to vote, did not know that they could vote, had never registered to vote. So what we see happening in the summer of 1964 are volunteers from across the country descending on the South, moving out into the rural areas and encouraging people to register to vote and to go and use that vote. This was, again, college students spending their summer riding buses into the South and explaining the right to vote to many of these disenfranchised people in the South. Now, this was, of course, a very dangerous thing to do because the establishment in the South did not necessarily want to have more African Americans register to vote, did not want to see these voting drives because that could undermine their power, that could undermine their electoral base. So many of the buses that were carrying these freedom riders into the South were met by violence. People standing along the sides of the road holding guns or throwing rocks at the buses. It was a very dangerous thing to do. And in fact, there were some fatalities that occur during this push for voting rights in the South. Now, at the same time that the Freedom Summer is taking place, and you have these college students encouraging people to register to vote, Congress passes the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And here you see President Johnson signing the act into law. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 was a major piece of legislation. And you can see in the title right there, that's just the title of the act, many of the things that it was supposed to do. An act to enforce the constitutional right to vote, to confer jurisdiction upon the district courts of the United States, to provide injunctive relief against discrimination in public accommodations, to authorize the Attorney General to institute suits to protect constitutional rights in public facilities and public education, to extend the Commission on Civil Rights to prevent discrimination in federally assisted programs, to establish a Commission on Equal Employment Opportunity, and for other purposes. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 directly involved the federal government in protecting the rights of disenfranchised individuals, of minority groups, through protecting the right to vote and all those other things that are listed there. So at the same time that the Freedom Summer is going on, you have the federal government passing the Civil Rights Act of 1964, really one of the keystone pieces of legislation in the civil rights movement. Now, as I mentioned, the Freedom Riders in the summer of '64 often met with violence and stiff resistance. And perhaps one of the most notorious cases of that resistance occurred outside the little town of Philadelphia, Mississippi, in the summer of 1964. How many of you remember the movie Mississippi Burning? No? It was probably 1988, 89. It is a fictionalized account of this episode. You had 3 civil rights workers in Philadelphia, Mississippi, who had gone into the countryside to help voters register, to register voters. They are actually arrested by the police and put in prison for a short time in Philadelphia. And then they are released. And they begin driving out of town. Of course, when they are driving out of town, what happens? But many of the white supremacists, many of those people who did not support civil rights, essentially ambush these 3 civil rights workers and murder them and bury their bodies in an earthen dam. Their disappearance becomes national news. And you see investigators descending on Philadelphia and other areas in that part of Mississippi to look for these 3 disappeared civil rights workers. Their bodies are eventually uncovered in an earthen dam. The perpetrators of the crime are eventually arrested and put on trial, but they are not convicted. I think they're put on trial several times for this crime and exonerated each time. But you see the risk that was taken by many of these volunteers. You can see how a voter registration drive could end in violence for those volunteers who were trying to get people to vote, to allow people to exercise their constitutional rights. Voting and voting rights and voting registration become a big theme of the civil rights movement by the mid-1960s. And one of the iconic voting rights marches occurs in Selma in 1965. How many of you have seen the movie Selma? Came out like 2 years ago. The Selma March originally begins as a voting rights march. The organizers of the march planned on marching from Selma to Montgomery, Alabama, to register to vote at the state capitol. Well, when the first march at Selma is held, the state police and other county authorities descend on the marchers with billy clubs and whips and tear gas and essentially break up the march. Now, this draws tremendous amount of national attention to the idea behind this voting rights march to Selma, Alabama. And several weeks later, a second march is organized. This one has important national figures who come to participate, including Dr. King. He goes to Selma and leads this voting rights march from Selma to Montgomery. To draw attention to the issue of people being driven from the polls, kept from exercising their right to vote, and kept from expressing their political opinion in the United States. The Selma March becomes iconic. The images of the marchers, both black and white, the symbolism of the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma itself become very significant in the civil rights movement. The Selma March eventually succeeds in what it was trying to do. The marchers do eventually make it to Montgomery. They do manage to spread the idea of voter registration. Yet it met stiff, violent resistance at first. The first march failed because it met such resistance. The second march, better organized, more publicized, bigger national spotlight on it, does succeed in achieving its goal. As a result of the actions that we see here, the Freedom Summer, the Selma March, another piece of legislation is passed. The Voting Rights Act of 1965. The Voting Rights Act gave the federal government broad powers to protect the voting rights of minorities in the United States. The federal government could use federal legal authority, federal troops to ensure that people had access to the polls, to ensure that people had the right to vote. So this is another major milestone in this civil rights movement, protecting the voting rights of minorities. Again, Johnson signing a piece of legislation, and who's standing in the background? Dr. King and other civil rights leaders. So by the time we get to the 1960s, there is tremendous federal involvement in the civil rights issue. There is more and more legislation being implemented to protect civil rights, to ensure legal equality. And there is fiercer resistance to this. There is violence, assassinations, bombings, beatings, that sort of thing. The civil rights movement in the 1960s is maturing, but so is the resistance to the civil rights movement. There are those segments of the American population who do not want to see social equality, who do not want to see legal equality among the races. So what were the immediate results of the Voting Rights Act? Suddenly, throughout the South, you see many more African Americans registering to vote, many more African Americans running for office, and the voting turnout of that minority group begins to expand. For generations, many of these people had thought that they had no legal right to vote, that they could not vote because of the state laws, because of the way the system had been set up. When the federal government passes the Voting Rights Act in 1965, it opened a lot of people's eyes, and it presented opportunity for many of these people who had been previously disenfranchised. So a tremendous piece of legislation that has immediate results in terms of voter registration and voter representation throughout the South and in the United States. Despite that, there was still, throughout many places of the South, fierce resistance. In 1966, James Meredith, who was the first African American student to enroll at Ole Miss, drawing attention to the fact that there were still hurdles in voter registration and voting rights, began a march in Mississippi to highlight those difficulties. While he was on this march, on June 6, 1966, he is shot. He's not killed. He does survive. But he is struck down by a would-be assassin. The image you see right there is moments after being shot as he is trying to crawl out of the road into the side of the grass. The attempted assassination of James Meredith served as a further rallying cry for many civil rights supporters, civil rights activists. People flocked to the hospital where he was being tended to. And within weeks of this attempted assassination, a larger body begins marching, completing the march that Meredith had begun. Again, showing the danger of pushing for your legal rights, of trying to destroy a system that had institutionalized racial inequality and racial segregation. Now, incidences like this and the assassination of Medgar Evers and the violent resistance to the civil rights movement sparked a growing violent response among many African Americans. What we see in the summer of 1966 is the establishment of the Black Panther Party. The Black Panther Party were among the most radical of the civil rights groups. The Black Panther Party was not above using violence to make their political point. They did run candidates for office, but they also were not beyond using intimidation and forced coercion to get their point across. They become kind of the most radical of the civil rights groups. Now, one of the goals of the Black Panther Party wasn't necessarily to end segregation, but it was to create sort of social equality, legal equality. But you know what? If they don't want to live with us, fine. We'll live over here. Those people can live over there as long as we have the same social standing as they do. There was, by this point, a growing, in many areas, attempt to maybe this idea of segregation or desegregation is just going to lead to more conflict. But we want the same legal rights, the same economic rights, the same political rights that other people have. So the Black Panther Party was not above using violence to achieve their means, to achieve their goals. As you can see in this image right over here, very militant in their poses, shotguns and shotgun shells strapped across you. They were very much willing to use force to achieve their goals. By the time we get to the mid to late 1960s, the civil rights movement is really beginning to fracture into many different political parties. You still had Dr. King, who was the leading figure, espousing this idea of nonviolence. But you had kind of the fringe groups, the Malcolm X group that came off. You have the Black Panther Party that wanted more vigorous action, even to the point of violence, to change society. Yet the main body of the civil rights movement generally tended to follow the ideas of Dr. King. This gradual push. Things are beginning to change. Legislation is being passed. The federal government is becoming more involved in protecting the rights of minorities. So the late 1960s were very much contentious in the civil rights movement. Things had begun to change, things had begun to improve, but there was still fraction, there was still resistance. Social equality had not occurred as effectively and as completely as many people had hoped. By 1968, Dr. King was still this important figure leading the nonviolent protests against oppression, but his movement had begun to expand. It had gone beyond just voting rights to social equality, legal equality, and now economic equality. In April of 1968, the sanitation workers in Memphis, Tennessee, went on strike. They worked hard for not a lot of pay. And they went on strike to improve their working conditions. Now, overwhelmingly, the sanitation workers in Memphis were African American. So we begin to see the linking of race and economic standing becoming much more apparent by 1968. So Dr. King goes to Memphis to support these striking workers, to lend his voice to their cry for better working conditions and better pay. And on the night of April 3rd, 1968, he gives a speech to the assembled crowd. He says in that speech, "Well, I don't know what will happen now. We've got some difficult days ahead, but it doesn't matter with me now because I've been to the mountaintop and I don't mind. Like anybody, I would like to live a long life. Longevity has its place, but I'm not concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will. And He's allowed me to go up to the mountain, and I've looked over and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we, as a people, will get to the promised land. There's almost a lot of foreshadowing in that, isn't there? Now, throughout his career as a civil rights leader, Dr. King had been under threat. His life had been threatened many, many times. In fact, one of his houses in Birmingham had been blown up. The anti-civil rights people had thrown a bomb onto his front porch and it blew up and part of the house burned down. So there was this constant danger in what he did. Yet by 1968, he was able to say, almost hopefully, that we've had our struggles, but we are almost there. We are almost to the top of the mountain. And once we get to the top of the mountain and we look over and we see the promised land, again, a very biblical allusion, talking about Moses and seeing the promised land, we will get there. And I might not get there with you, but we as a people will get there. Well, the next day in Memphis, Dr. King steps out onto the balcony of the Lorraine Motel and is shot and killed by a hidden assassin, a white supremacist assassin, James Earl Ray. The death of Dr. King in 1968 in many ways marks the end of this part of the story of civil rights, the hard physical struggle to push for social and legal equality. In the wake of Dr. King's assassination, another piece of federal legislation has passed, the Civil Rights Act of 1968, which forbid discrimination in housing and other accommodations. So what we see in the 1960s is a more vocal, a more populist, a more present civil rights movement met with increasing brutality and violence. Yet at the federal level, at the legislative level, the federal government becomes more involved in ensuring civil rights and protecting civil rights and pushing civil rights legislation. Dr. King becomes a martyr to this cause. He was right in that he would not get to the promised land, but he knew that that promised land was there somewhere. And what we see happening after the assassination of Dr. King is that the shape of the civil rights movement changes. It's no longer so much focused on protests and public displays. Those still occur, but not to the degree that they once did. It becomes more of a legislative effort. And we see state governments and federal governments pushing for more change, pushing to ensure equality. The federal government really becomes the key player in the securing of civil rights for those disenfranchised minorities. And what happens? Well, do we achieve Dr. King's vision? Had you asked that question maybe 5 years ago, you might have a different answer than you have today. What is the political situation in the United States today? Do we need to revisit this? Is there going to be another civil rights movement? And if there is, what shape does it take? So this story, this part of our American story, seeks to solve a major issue in American society, one that has been there really since the beginning of the American story. And were there successes? Yes. But was that success complete? Do we live in a country that lives up to its ideals, where all men are created equal? Or are we still separated by things like race and religion and economics? Maybe that's the question we need to ask and really look at as part of the legacy of the civil rights movement. So, does anybody have any questions?
How is it we're still so segregated? I mean, look at us here.
A lot of that has to do with economics.
Yeah, to a point.
And
But I
I
don't
mean,
think that today the North is any better than the South.
well,
I mean, we have,
if you've
our whites seem to, we've had much more white flight in the North. And left our cities.
And again, a lot of that has to do with economics. Why in the 1940s and 1950s do you see this so-called white flight? Why do people start leaving, white people start leaving the cities and moving out to the suburbs? It's because they can afford to. With economic prosperity, the economic prosperity that emerged after the Second World War, you see this economic division in American society.
But it wasn't only that.
That's a big factor in it. But there's also kind of inherent distrust of the other, perhaps. You know, if you are in an all-white neighborhood and a non-white family moves in, who's going to be the difference in that neighborhood? Who stands out, right? And who can be kind of singled out for ridicule or for blame or for whatever. Race, segregation, integration is a major issue in American society, and it has been for centuries. In the last part of the 20th century, that discussion and the efforts to kind of rectify those issues and kind of support the idea of at least legal and social equality really begins to accelerate through the civil rights movement. Obviously, we haven't achieved that. We haven't achieved perfection yet. Is it something that we can achieve? That depends on individuals. That depends on all of us and everybody else. But we can still strive for something like that.
Was part of the prerequisite for voting not just being able to read, and I forget what else, but that you also had to have somebody who had been voting, kind of like back you up before you could vote?
Now, in order to vote in the United States, the only requirement is that you are a citizen of the United States who's over the age of 18. But voting requirements have changed over time. When the Constitution was first drafted, in order to be able to vote, you had to be a white male over the age of 21 who owned property.
Oh, yeah.
So it very much limited who could vote. By the time we get to the 18 teens, 1820s, it's broadened who could vote. White males over the age of 21 who paid taxes. More people were able to vote. It isn't until 1869, with the ratification of the 15th Amendment, that it was white and black males over the age of 21 who could vote. And it isn't until 1920, with the ratification of the 19th Amendment, that women were allowed to vote. And then it's 1972 that the voting age is lowered to 18. And that's as a result of the Vietnam War, but that's an entirely different topic. So there were different requirements for what was required to vote. Now the states have their own voting requirement laws.
I think down south there was something about black person had to have somebody as their sponsor, so to speak. And if you were black, there weren't many options as to who would be sponsor because the white people wouldn't sponsor them, and the other blacks hadn't voted yet.
In the wake of Reconstruction, so the late 1880s, really going up until about the 1950s, many of the states in the South had legal mechanisms for keeping African Americans disenfranchised. One thing was called a grandfather clause, and it said you could vote if your grandfather could vote. Well, in the 1880s, whose grandfathers could vote?
Nobody.
Well,
Nobody.
you couldn't, if your grandfather was a slave, that grandfather wasn't voting. So you had things like that. You had literacy tests that were imposed, that you had to be able to read a certain number of words. And oftentimes, who didn't know how to read?
Black people.
Because under slavery, they were not allowed to get an education. You also sometimes had poll taxes that were implemented. So if you want to vote, you have to pay a tax. And who does that target? But those people who don't have money to pay a tax. So there were various mechanisms that were used legal mechanisms that were used to keep people away from the polls. All of that was aimed at essentially isolating the African Americans and not allowing them to vote. So what was the big threat when we get to the Voting Rights Act and Freedom Summer and stuff like that? All of a sudden, you're going to start enfranchising these people. They're going to start having a political voice, and that can undermine the legal structure that had been established in many of these southern states. If we want to kind of draw this into modern politics, and we look at the Alabama Senate race last month, who made the difference in the voting? It was black female voters who voted overwhelmingly for Doug Jones against Roy Moore and tipped the election in favor of Doug Jones. So the ability to vote and using the ability to vote can have significant social, legal, economic impact. And I guess that's really one of the lessons to take away from this civil rights struggle, is that the vote is a powerful tool if people are willing to wield it.
In the case that Doug Jones prosecuted the 4 girls that were killed in the Baptist church, what was their punishment when they finally were convicted, and who were they or how many were there?
I don't remember the details. I believe there were a couple of people and at least several manslaughter convictions.
Just manslaughter?
Manslaughter. I think that's what it was, but I could be. I mean, I can look it up afterwards if you want to stick around for 2 minutes.
You know what just occurred to me in this, and it has before, it just seems like people are always looking for a group to put down. And it's so much more dramatic because of what happened and how the African Americans got here. But it was almost like, okay, so they were, and I'm not comparing it because I don't believe you can say it's the same at all. But, whether it was the first immigrants who came and it was, this nationality versus that one. And then it became, well, wait, here's a group that everybody can say based on race. And it sort of, I'm hopeful, but it's going to take a lot for it to ever. I don't think it'll ever end. I think it will get better.
Because groups always try to identify themselves by being different than others. So if you see somebody who is different from you and from your family and from your community, they become the outsiders. And that kind of forms a cohesion in that group. One of the, obviously with African Americans, the story is much more complex because it has to do with the issue of slavery and what happens when slavery is abolished in 1865 and the role of the federal government in kind of punishing the South, and as a way of doing that, they kind of artificially elevate the African Americans in many cases, and then the reaction to that, which establishes the Jim Crow South, and the controversy over Confederate monuments. Where were many of those Confederate monuments built? Immediately after the end of Reconstruction, so the 1880s, 1890s, and then again in the early 1920s. When you have the reemergence of groups like the Ku Klux Klan and kind of the roots of the civil rights movement. So they're very much tied into the politics of the time when the monuments were built. So race, religion, ethnicity are very easy crutches on which to build a distrust of others.
If you look at things like
immigration is a great example of that.
Things like music. I mean, so if you want, you can identify with people who are different. If you're musically talented, it's the Harlem Renaissance, and we still have a long way to go there with all the stuff with Academy Awards in Hollywood. But,
Right.
But that's not the first thing that people gravitate for in terms of something different.
Yeah.
The others are just so obvious.
I have a talk that I've given a few times on I don't know if I've given it here, immigration history. And when you look at immigration history, you see, a lot of the same themes that we hear in the news today that were repeated in the 1800s. Immigrants are coming here, they're going to take American jobs, they're all criminals, they're going to kill all the Americans, they're going to, undermine the American system, that sort of thing. The arguments that you hear from certain segments of the population today are the same things that were being said in the 1870s. And each generation, there's a new immigrant group that becomes kind of the target of this kind of bitter diatribe. In the 1880s, it was Asians, and you have things like the Chinese Exclusion Act that is passed. Why Asians? Well, Asians weren't coming here as criminals. They weren't really coming in numbers large enough to take American jobs, but they were different enough that they were easy to pick on. So you see religion used as a excuse to keep people out. Catholics, particularly Eastern and Southern European Catholics in the 1890s and 19-teens, are targets of legislation and hatred by nativist groups in the United States. So, as I said at the beginning, we have a great country, we have a great history, but there are flaws in the history of the United States. There are things that when looking back on, you see as sins. Every country has them. I think part of the reason why when we think about American history, some of those sins look so drastic is because of the idea of the United States versus the practice of the United States are often very much at odds. All right, well, thanks. I hope you found that enjoyable.